We now move into the final segment of today's session, the Q&A panel. Our three speakers will now be joined by two additional panellists, Adam Lee from Engineers Australia and Chris Neeram from Building Designers Association of Australia. Adam Lee is a Senior Policy Advisor for Engineers Australia, specialising in buildings, infrastructure and space. Starting his work life off as a graduate engineer at McConnell Dowell, he then moved on to design engineering roles before deciding he wanted to try something a little different and moved into the policy space. Working at the cross-section between engineering and policy making, Adam strived to ensure that the best engineering principles and solutions are used by governments to improve the lives of people across Australia. Chris Neeram is a multifaceted industry leader serving as the CEO of the Building Designers Association of Australia. In addition to this pivotal role, Chris chairs the Australian Design Alliance, is the board secretary of the Museum of Understanding Through Tolerance and Inclusion, is also a board member of the Australian Construction Industry Forum, and contributes to a variety of government committees, including the Steering Committee with the New South Wales Building Commissioner and the Australian Building Codes Board. As an international award-winning designer and builder, Chris boasts an illustrious career decorated with over 50 industry awards. His extensive experience spans across the globe, where he has been involved in a wide array of specialist projects. Chris's expertise has not only been recognised by industry, but also captured the attention of the media. His work has been showcased on internationally broadcast TV shows like Grand Designs Australia, and he serves as a feature writer for Grand Designs magazine. To begin, I will start off with some pre-prepared questions, and I will start by asking Diane, what might we consider to be realistic timeframes for digital traceability to become mainstream in the building industry?
The world is changing very fast. I don't need to tell anybody that. To answer that, I take the example of QR codes. Pre-COVID, we had the combustible cladding and the ACPs, and there was a process of how are we going to permanently label ACPs panels, aluminium composite panels, and there was the biggest debate, how do we do machine readable, human readable? It was just such a huge problem. How can we deal with it? COVID came along and suddenly we all had QR codes and we're all using them just fine. It solved the problem overnight, and just how quickly something that went from so complex to so simple and resolved with technology can happen it's a good lesson. Traceability is really getting ahead of steam. Now even the ABCB is including it in their documents, and the government is talking about it. So it is happening and happening quickly. And when we have the climate reporting going live in January, large corporations are going to need to be able to have the evidence and have the traceability through their supply chains. They're going to demand this. We already know Lend-Lease has got it in their embodied carbon requirements through their system. They already are demanding this information, so it will happen very quickly. But it won't happen consistently and across everywhere at once. It's going to be little pockets, and we've seen what Andrew's doing in steel, how that's moving ahead. So it will come at us from different areas very quickly, but eventually we'll get that joined up system, that ideal world, if we can stay the course with our common principles.
Diane, if people were to really latch onto a single message from the National Building Product Coalition's report, what would you hope that might be?
That we as an industry need to drive this. We need to keep working together. We need to keep talking, and we need to keep demanding what it is that we need from our building product information and the systems that will take that through the supply chain. And we need to keep doing what we're doing, because that's the only way we're going to get the outcomes that we need. Non-conforming products and the issue of building product information has been kicking around for the whole time I've been working, and long before. One of my colleagues talks about something back in the 1920s that she had up in her office. So wasn't her personally, but back in her office. So we need to drive this. We need to take charge and say, this is what we need, and share that across with the manufacturers and suppliers, building practitioners, the designers, the specifiers, and the installers and the builders and the certifiers. Let's work together and say, this is what we need in our building product information, and make it happen.
Neil and Di, in the Building Confidence Report by Bronwyn Weir and Peter Shergold, recommended building ministers resolve a position on a mandatory product certification system for high-risk products. Your work with the ABCB saw the development of the National Product Assurance Framework in response to this recommendation. Have your views changed in respect to the outcomes of this work?
Well, the simple answer is no, my views haven't changed, other than I firmly believe now more than ever that you have to treat this as a holistic exercise. And I know that's fairly easy to say, much harder to do. But if we go all the way back to Dame Judith Hackett's assessment of what took place with Grenfell, her resulting recommendations, she stressed the importance to the British government of not cherry picking the outcomes of her work, that you had to treat them as interoperable. And Bronwyn Weir and Peter Shergold made almost the identical assessment and overview of their own work. And then when you look at the framework for products that Di essentially authored through the work of the Australian Building Codes Board, it again just resonates that to start pulling elements out one by one lessens the impact of their collective utility. And so when we start to see the work that's being produced now, where the focus is on traceability, I find that traceability is really difficult to do on its own without thinking about compliance and enforcement, education and training, ensuring that we have the appropriate evidence of suitability provisions in the National Construction Code that make the links to the traceability material. Obviously, some things will always change around technology, the capacity of industry to be able to respond to the technology and the regulations. So there's a constant need to be able to educate, which probably isn't picked up specifically in those provisions. And the other thing that isn't picked up directly in the 5 elements is the chain of responsibility legislation. I think that's a really useful adjunct to the implementation of the product assurance framework, which is holding people accountable in the supply chain. Thanks, Di.
Oh, I'd say those two things were picked up in the product assurance framework. So we
Not,
didn't
not,
miss
not,
any.
not explicitly.
Yeah, no, the supply chain is in the enforcement, the chain of
Yeah.
responsibility legislation, and the powers for the states and territories to be able to, the enforcement powers that are in the chain of responsibility legislation. And having that oversight and information feedback loop. One of the things that was really interesting for me was in the ACP and the combustible cladding debacle, was just how long a history there was of problems overseas largely that we didn't learn from, and that where people in our system were picking it up, knowing that there was a problem there and we needed to do something, we didn't have a system where you could actually follow through and do something and resolve it. So it really took something like Grenfell before our system could respond. So yes, no, my views haven't changed. I think it was a really comprehensive piece of work. It was a really valuable exercise, and that while Neil's kind of saying that I authored it, I was actually a conduit in that of a huge amount of industry expertise, and people were so generous with their knowledge and time as to how this could work. And I'm just collating it and pulling it together so that it could be a comprehensive approach, but also realistic, and trying to manage how the risk was assigned. So not coming up with a solution that all the eggs in one basket, that we would have this magical register that would give you a green tick and a red cross for every product, but how could it actually be practically achieved out in the real world? And having that suite of that system of those 5 elements and all the recommendations that sit under them covered off was a realistically achievable but robust system. That's really important.
Thank you, Di. Neil, having regard to international exemplars, where are the weaknesses in the current system or the differences?
Yeah, I think one of the main weaknesses, which might sound a bit strange, is that we've inherited and developed a culture across industry where we're not being serious enough in looking at product claims and verifying the product claims. Now, I don't want that to be interpreted as some sort of generalization that should be applied across the industry, but when we look at international exemplars, there are other parts of the world where the culture within the industry is such, and it may be driven by things such as the risk of litigation, which is the case in the US. It might be driven by the behaviour of officials who have responsibility ultimately for approving plans to ensure that all of the documentation that they've got in front of them can be used in a way that verifies the claims of the products that are being used in a building. But in the absence of those sort of cultural behaviours and cultural norms, we have what has often been referred as a race to the bottom. And there are multiple drivers for that, cost obviously being a key one. Often some of the products that we've had and experienced problems with are the last things that go on buildings. So if your construction costs are running over budget, then substituting products can become an attractive proposition. And again, that might not be done necessarily with an intention to create an unsafe building. But the unintentional outcome of that is that you may inadvertently be putting a product on that doesn't conform with the requirements of the schemes, is substandard, has less durability than the original specified product, all of those kinds of things which flow on ultimately to impact consumers. I think the other jurisdiction that you really have to look at, and it's a collective jurisdiction, is Europe. The European Union has some very strong directives and requirements around building products, particularly with the CE mark. Now, the CE mark doesn't apply in all circumstances, but where products are deemed to need a CE mark, that becomes an additional level of verification, and if you like, a gold standard that everyone looks for. But there are risks associated even with those types of situations, because one would think that Codemark is potentially the gold standard in Australia. Codemark's not a mandatory scheme, but where a product has a Codemark certificate, in theory and potentially in practice, you've got a certificate that has been the subject of third-party assessment, product testing, product inspection, ongoing surveillance of products, etc. Yet we've had examples where products that have been subject to Codemark certificates, those certificates have been found to be less than perfect. So there's got to be ongoing rigour in the whole regulatory system to ensure that even those processes are the subject of ongoing and close scrutiny. And the last thing I wanted to make an observation about is around the way in which the TIC infrastructure, the testing, inspection, certification infrastructure, much of which Andrew outlined in his presentation, can play a key role in providing that level of assurance. But it's got to be on the basis that certification bodies have been through an accreditation process, testing laboratories have been through an accreditation process, and there is ongoing oversight of their performance through auditing, etc. And that's where we can all get a higher degree of assurance that the system and the the products that are being certified within that system are meeting our expectations.
Thank you, Neil. I might actually mix up the questions a little bit just to give some of our other panelists a chance to answer. So Chris and Adam, do you believe digital traceability will take away some of the guesswork and responsibility of certain actors in the supply chain? Or do you still envisage each party retains an accountability?
Yeah, look, I definitely think it's going to take away some of the guesswork, but we need to ensure that parties retain accountability. That's the biggest thing, is accountability throughout the whole industry. Each of the actors in the supply chain really needs to retain responsibility for their role, but the digital traceability itself will distribute this responsibility more evenly. I guess and also, if a fault arises, the system can clearly show which party was responsible. Also reducing disputes over where the issue occurred, and with digital records, auditing process become quicker and more efficient. This leaves less room, I guess, for manual errors and omissions, and reducing the time and effort spent by each party ensuring compliance and responsibility. Again, accountability is huge. Over to you, Adam.
Absolutely, Chris. I can't support you more in that statement. Absolutely, I think that the digital traceability will take away a lot of the guesswork, but as you say, the accountability is paramount, and that's something that Engineers Australia has always advocated for, is making sure that each party is accountable for the work that they're doing. Particularly as well when it comes to, as you were saying, the that definition of the roles and define and having that ease during the audit process of finding where things have gone wrong. Certainly the traceability system will very much help with that sort of thing, and also pushing forward as well the ability to make substitutions and all those sorts of things, I think will be also assisted by this traceability framework. You can very much substitute products which are like for like much easier, right, and have much better information given about those products and whether that is actually a like for like replacement. Certainly that is something engineers get questions of all the time, or in the not so good cases, they don't get the questions at all, and we get problems down the road. So certainly that accountability and the ability to trace is really key.
Thank you. Chris and Adam, again, there's a need to re-establish confidence across the industry and consumers in the use of compliant and conforming building products. Having regard to the work of the NBPC, what else can the industry do? So
I want to go back to Neil's earlier point about this race to the bottom. I think that is one of probably the key areas where the industry can do more to assist and re-establish that confidence. And using this framework and is really a good way to sort of do that. But I also think we really need to get rid of this race to the bottom. As Neil was saying, if you are at the end of your project, or even if you're halfway through the project and you're starting to look to pinch pennies, what are the first things that go is, maybe, can I get away with that cheaper steel? Can I get away with that cheaper cladding? Can I get away with all these cheaper products? That traceability framework, once again, helps us ensure that that the products are doing what they're supposed to, and that they're fit for purpose.
My point is, I guess they really need to establish clear and enforceable quality control measures across the supply chain, really involving independent certification schemes to ensure products consistently meet the Australian standard specifications. The industry itself, has to work closely with the government bodies to ensure regulations are updated in line with technological advancements and market needs, and obviously regular reviews and enforcements of the regulations would really help meet compliance. And importantly, I think what's missing a lot is education, offering education programs to manufacturers, suppliers, builders, and also consumers, I believe is really important. Educating all of them about, what a compliant product actually looks like, and, and why are they essentially critical. Training really needs to focus both on the technical standards and also legal responsibilities for all. I guess finally, mandating more frequently independent inspections and audits of products used in the construction, particularly after they've been installed, because a lot of people will say, oh, we're putting this product, or, you know, on a designer's designs, it'll be or similar or alike, but what is actually really installed on the building. So we really need to ensure that those products that are installed on the building are actually compliant and maintained throughout the life cycle of the building itself.
That is actually a really pertinent point you raised there, Chris, about education. And I think, you know, currently education is very focused at the specifiers or the building design professionals, and spreading that onus and that responsibility, and understanding that once something installed, if you maintain it or in an incorrect way or replace it with a not for like product, the implications of that are really, really important. And I might put forward a question from the chat from Brad Scott, who has noted, is there a lot of work to be done in the procurement areas in relation to interactions between manufacturer, supplying products and design specification? He has identified a gap, maybe open to all the panelists.
Well, I think procurement is a key part of the supply chain, and it's identified in much of the literature that we've referenced today, and other documentation. And of course, it's part of the reason why we're hosting this particular event, because we felt that whilst we've spoken or tried to speak to manufacturers and suppliers, and we've spoken to regulators, and we're looking to talk to the building surveyors, who are another key part of this exercise, the specifiers, the designers who inevitably document which products are going to be used. The relationship between them and then the procurement process is critical. And I do go back to the point that Chris was making in his presentation. The manufacturers and suppliers, as part of that procurement process, have a key responsibility, because some of the documentation that's out there talks about the material that they use to try and convince specifiers and designers to use their particular products. And often that information is quite misleading. So it will make reference to test reports that don't relate to their products, or the product that's being specified, or it's the information's out of date, or they've, if you like, manipulated some of that information. And it was actually the Grenfell report, the last report that came out last week. This was one of the key findings, that they said the brochures and material that was being used by the manufacturers to convince the designers to use their products misrepresented what their products should be used for. So that whole intersection between what the manufacturers and suppliers are putting into their material for the purposes of selling that product, to the specifiers who are then looking at that material and procuring that product, is fundamentally critical.
Yeah, I think the specifiers know what they want. Yeah, when you're designing and specifying a building, you know what materials you're after. I think it's documenting that nice and clearly, and pushing that forward, is that this is what we're after. I think it's where the digital traceability comes in. It then says, okay, is this being provided? I think someone said that, yeah, once you start putting a digital traceability in there, there's nowhere for the bad actors to hide. So those who are trying to cheat, it gets a lot more complicated. But I think specifying up front is critical, and that's what we're trying to push. Is, yeah, when the building surveyor comes to check a building off, and he says, I'm not sure about the steel, and they say, well, it doesn't say you have to have this particular steel. We've provided some steel, and yeah, so specifying is critical, I think, is what it boils down to.
Yeah, I can add to that. A lot of the information that goes out, like we talk about, is on drawings that people say to be confirmed or similar or alike, and then the builder goes and substitutes that material for another material. The issue that we've got is, in Australia, you've got to meet either a 6 or 7 star minimum compliance. Now, nobody actually goes back to check if that material's been substituted, how does that actually affect the thermal performance of that building? And does it actually still meet 6 or 7 star minimum compliance? And most often than not, it doesn't. And therefore, we've got a lot of homes being built around Australia that are basically deemed non-compliant, something we really need to push. New South Wales government, and part of that steering committee with David Chandler, the biggest push was that we wanted to make sure that when people specify materials for a project, the materials have been specified are actually going on the job, and you can't substitute the materials. It's something we really need to mandate across Australia. Yes, you can change the material at any time, but it needs to be a group decision and not a decision made by a builder because he's got a cheaper alternative from overseas.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Chris.
just to back you up on that one, Chris, we had a case that came that sort of was put before us. A builder substituted a double glazed window with a single glazed window. Now they'd run it past the energy sort of thing, but they hadn't run it past the mechanical guys to check the pressure, that ability to cope with the pressure differentials when you open fire doors and all these sorts of things throughout the building. So now they've got this building, when one person opens a door, everybody knows because the windows are shaking because of the massive pressure differential put through it.
Well, that's we've probably got time for one more question, so I'll put another one from the chat box from Brett Highland. I think this one might be for you, Neil. So Brett's noted that currently there's expected to be a convergence expected between safety and performance characteristics that are considered drivers for change, health and safety of large numbers of lives. Is there any kind of comment or feedback you'd like to share, Neil?
Well, I think it's a question that also relates to one that Brad Scott has posed, which I have just responded to, which is around the fact that our codes and standards for decades are focused on, and quite rightly focused on, occupant health and safety. And therefore, you would imagine that the big driver for wanting better information, reliable information, traceable information about products is around their health and safety characteristics. You know, is the product going to combust easily? Is the product going to lead to structural failure? Is the product going to result in significant loss of amenity as a result of failure? They're the sort of fundamentals of our codes and standards. But the thing that's more likely going to drive a better culture and practice around products, product testing, product certification is now the environmental drivers, which are, you know, latecomers. They're the contemporary issues that we're focused on for good reason. But we're actually building an entire infrastructure around how do we verify the claims being made around the environmental performance of products. In order to do that, we need to improve, or we're introducing EPDs. We need to be able to verify that information. That information needs to be traceable. And it's that infrastructure that's probably going to be retrofitted to the more traditional characteristics of building products that we should have been focused on decades ago, and we haven't been. So it's kind of a perverse outcome that the environmental performance and characteristics of products are potentially going to drive a better outcome in the reporting of more traditional characteristics of products.
Beata, I can add to that. Are you done, Neil?
Yeah, I am.
I believe, you know, when people are mentioning about the products itself and going on this list, this is going to be, you know, hopefully when it comes into fruition, a record or data of all the materials. And we're going to be able to go back in 5 and 10 years and 15 years and 20 years. So when they're saying that this is UV rated for 20 years, we'll be able to know whether it is or not, because we'll have records of that in the system. I think this is going to be a significant part that's going to be part of the evolution of this once this is rolling, because I've no doubt it's going to come in. And, you know, I could see a comment from Brad talked about the procurement and the introduction of new materials, making it more difficult to introduce. I actually don't think so, because if we make it part of a mandatory, I guess if it's mandatory that we make sure that anybody that has a product that wants to be part of this register, you have to put some specs behind. You have to be able to put the information. Obviously, for smaller companies, it's going to be difficult as opposed to big, you know, corporations being able to fund this. However, we've got to start to put something like this together, and we've got to start somewhere, because it's an absolute mess where it currently is.
That's very interesting.
Yes. The the takeaway for me is that it's how can we each be clear in our corner of the industry, this is the information that we need, and making sure that we build that shared understanding across all our industries. And let's start demanding it. Let's start making it happen in our corner, but in a way that it can be joined up with the rest of the supply chain. Let's not sit around and wait. And that will mean getting into those procurement areas that may not have got the memo yet, that things are changing and that they need to be getting better information in the products, or whichever part of the industry that you're working in. But let's start pulling together that shared understanding of our information, because it's only going to get more complicated as we add these additional layers. And as Neil said, we weren't doing the product assurance very well. So now we have these additional layers that we need to do well. So we're going to need to start working differently and start working together in a more collaborative, transparent way to get that information that we need for good buildings.
Andrew, did you have any final things to add?
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with Neil there. I think it's traceability we've been trying to push for 20 odd years, and it's it's paper-based, so it's difficult, but there's just been a sort of a half-hearted push with it or from the industry. But I think now, particularly with the ESG requirements, I think it's going to actually have to happen for the ESG requirements, which is good. So we can actually hop on board with that one and push it through. But I think it's, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the efficiencies we can gain by going through digital certification. If we can get this information digitally, that might cut a whole lot of officers down who are collecting a whole lot of paperwork to make sure this product's compliant. So there's efficiencies to be had there, which is worthwhile looking at.
And all the tools exist now. We've got the QR codes in our phones. The UN has written the protocols. All the bolts and the nuts and bolts we need to pull this together exist. We just need to get on and make it happen.
Fantastic. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's session and all your questions and the discussion in the chat. And we encourage all of you to visit NBPC's webpage and LinkedIn page, read the Traceability and Digitalisation of Building Product Information Implementation Guide, get your organisation behind the efforts to improve traceability by signing the pledge, and get in touch with any follow-up questions. Thank you to ASBN and Ken Long for hosting, all the speakers and panelists, and to all of you for being part of the conversation toward influencing positive change in our industry. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this, so thank you.